Okay, my name's Jonathan Cook. I'm a British journalist. I've been living in Nazareth in Israel, northern Israel, for the last 5 years. I've come here as a freelance journalist. I was originally a staff journalist with The Guardian, but came out here to do my own projects. One of the main things was to write a book, which has taken me, I was planning to do it in about a year or 2 years, and it's taken me 5 years to do it. And the book was published in 2006 in the summer, called Blood and Religion, The Unmasking of the Jewish and Democratic State. And I also write regularly for newspapers and websites, particularly the sort of progressive alternative websites like Counterpunch, antiwar.com, Information Clearinghouse, these kind of publications.
Let's begin with your view of the conflict in Palestine-Israel when you first came to the region, and how your outlook has changed after 5 years of living here.
Well, I think I came with a slightly different perspective to start with, because one of the first things that interested me was looking at what was happening with the Palestinian community inside Israel. This is a community most people don't know a great deal about. They're a fifth of the Israeli population. They've been here since 1948. They have citizenship, and they're not strictly speaking part of the conflict. But it occurred to me that there was a lot that could be learnt about the conflict from looking at this community, because they are Palestinians, but they're also Israelis. They've been Israelis for nearly 6 decades. So I was interested to see how that citizenship, how they coped with that citizenship, and also how Israel coped with them being citizens when they're also Palestinians. One of the first things I noticed was that Israel seemed very reluctant to refer to them as Palestinians. It always referred to them as Israeli Arabs, or even sometimes it didn't want to refer to them as Arabs. It would refer to them as Bedouin, as Muslims, as Christians, as Druze, as their religious communities, rather than as a national group. So it intrigued me why Israel had these issues with what to call this community, why it just couldn't call them Palestinians. And in investigating that, I found out a lot of information about the history of this community and how much of that history was being concealed from them as well as from the rest of the world. For instance, in the education system here, it's still not possible for Palestinians to know anything about their history, about the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened to them as a people in 1948. In fact, I mean, they have a separate education system, so they are governed by different sets of rules. What they can teach in their schools are different from what can be taught in Israeli Jewish schools. For instance, a poet like Mahmoud Darwish cannot be taught in an Arab school, but can be taught in a Jewish school, because it's considered that there are nationalist overtones to his poetry, and therefore it's considered problematic. So these kinds of questions were very interesting to me, and I spent a lot of time investigating them, and in that way started to have a different perspective on Israel, both in its conflict with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and also in terms of being a Jewish state, what a Jewish state requires to maintain itself and its legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens.
What are the key themes of your new book, Blood and Religion? What do you hope readers will learn that they may not have been exposed to until now?
Well, I hope it will open up the whole question of what Israel has been doing since 1948, what its intentions are, and whether it's really interested in peace with the Palestinians at any level, inside its own borders, borders that the international community recognizes, and also in terms of the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. One of the major issues in the book, one of the things I look at quite closely, and I don't think anybody else has really looked at, is a movement that developed in the 1990s following the Oslo peace process, what people term the peace process. Now, the point of Oslo was to set in motion a process which most people believed would lead to two nations being established, two certain nations, neighboring nations, a Jewish state, and Israel, inside defined borders, and also a new Palestinian state that most people assumed would be in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the question that was left unclear, but I think Israeli leaders had a very clear idea. What it implied was what was going to happen to the Palestinians inside Israel, this fifth of the population who are Palestinians. Where would they stand after this peace process had taken effect? Now, we know from what the Israeli leadership was saying at the time that they had very strong views that the Palestinians should renounce, inside Israel, should renounce all claims to a national identity of any kind, any ideas of cultural autonomy, just being Palestinians, having control over their own institutions could not be allowed. And what happened from the Palestinian community inside Israel was the opposite. They started to realize that they were going to remain inside Israel. There wasn't going to be a one-state solution. There were going to be two states, and they were going to be in the Israeli state, not the Palestinian state. So it was clear to them that their Israeli citizenship was a given to both sides, to the Palestinian side and to the Israeli side. And therefore, they had to think very clearly for the first time about what their Israeli citizenship meant. They'd been living with discrimination for 5 decades and hadn't really confronted that question. They'd left it as a final status issue, along with all the other ones like Jerusalem and the refugees and so on. So this question of what was going to happen to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, what they themselves wanted, had not really been addressed until the Oslo peace process kicked in the 1990s. So in about 96, 97, we saw a new development among the Palestinians inside Israel, which is that they started demanding real citizenship. For the first time, they said, well, okay, we don't want this second-class kind of citizenship. We want genuine citizenship. We want equality with the Jews inside the state. And they gave this campaign a label. They called, what they were demanding was a state of all its citizens. Azmi Bashara, who was one of their leading politicians, articulated this, particularly this notion, but it was accepted by all the political groups within the community, and generally it was a popular idea. Now for Israel it created major problems. Israel realized that the idea of a state of all its citizens, just the idea of it, was problematic because it immediately highlighted that Israel wasn't quite what it was claiming to be, which was a Jewish and democratic state. It started to suggest that there was a conflict between the Jewish definition of the state and its democratic self-definition, that these things were opposed rather than complementary. And so the Palestinians inside Israel and their campaign, political campaign that really took off in the late 1990s, became extremely problematic for Israel. And the Israeli leadership started to rethink its relationship with the Palestinians inside Israel. And that's really, I'm looking at what happened from the beginning of the Intifada. The Intifada was an important turning point, not only for the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also for the Palestinians inside Israel, living as citizens. Because what happened at that point was that Israel realized it had a pretext for treating the Palestinians as a fifth column. As soon as there was an intifada, it could redefine the Palestinian population inside Israel, no longer as just ordinary citizens, but as a fifth column of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And it found that moment when it could redefine its Palestinian citizens at the very moment when the intifada erupted in the occupied territories, because at that moment there were demonstrations in support of the Palestinians in the major cities in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, Palestinian cities, such as Nazareth here. And Israel used that as an opportunity to reimagine its Palestinian population, to recraft the image of the Palestinian population inside Israel for its own Israeli citizens, its Jewish Israeli citizens. And what it did was send in the police force, heavily armed, with rubber bullets and with live ammunition, and started shooting at demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators inside Palestinian cities like Nazareth, treating them exactly the same way as the army was treating the Palestinians in the occupied territories, leading most Israeli Jews to make the connection, which is that if the army needed to use this kind of force against the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and the police needed to use the same kind of force against Palestinians inside Israel, then they must be doing the same kind of thing. They must be subversive in the same kind of way. And so not only did 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel die in those brief few days before they were shocked into submission. I mean, very quickly the demonstrations petered out because people realized that they were just going to be shot if they went out onto the street and demonstrated. But it left a legacy for both communities. The legacy for the Israeli Jewish community was a view of Palestinians inside Israel as no longer proper citizens, as no longer loyal citizens, even though that they'd created virtually no problems for 6 decades. The image of them had totally changed overnight. Now they were seen as a threat, a security threat, and there were boycotts, for instance, in Nazareth. People stopped coming to Nazareth. Israeli Jews stopped visiting Nazareth. They'd come here often on the Shabbat to eat the hummus, to get their cars fixed. I can't say there was much coexistence going on, but there was at least a relationship. People came, they felt comfortable in communities like Nazareth. They stopped coming. They started seeing this as the same as the occupied territories, as dangerous territories, enemy, hostile territory, and they stopped coming. Now, for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, there were also a legacy. They realized that that their citizenship was meaningless, that there was no way that Israel was going to ever treat them as the same kind of citizen as an Israeli Jew. Their citizenship had different kind of meaning and content. And so this really was a fracture point. I think in the 2001, 2002, we really saw a moment where the two communities just moved apart. And that hasn't really changed, although superficially things look a lot better. But I think you'll notice it in things like, for instance, the election campaigns. The Palestinian citizens of Israel have always been one of the best communities in terms of voting, and they have very high turnout. They've always turned out 80% plus have turned out and voted in the elections. Now, what's been happening is there's been a growing boycott movement. People have stopped voting. I think the figures for the last election were, I think off the top of my head, it were 57% of something. That's the figure that I remember. It was in the high 50s. That's a massive reduction in the percentage of Palestinians voting inside Israel. So it was a sign that a loss of trust in the system, and a sense that the system really didn't relate to Palestinian citizens and wouldn't relate to them in any meaningful way, that the future of Israel as a Jewish state did not include them. And we're seeing that, I think, in new developments. The most obvious one perhaps being the addition of Avigdor Lieberman to the Israeli cabinet quite recently. And this is a sign of the consensus that is building inside the Jewish community against the idea of the citizenship of Palestinians inside Israel continuing in the form that they currently enjoy it.
This has developed into a kind of civil rights struggle, certainly from the Palestinian-Israeli perspective, and so one would imagine that there are allies in this struggle from within the Israeli Jewish community. Has there been any significant support from within the Jewish population of Israel?
I think that's one of the most depressing things, actually, that there are small, very small Jewish groups that are starting to identify with these issues. They've recognized the significance, the turning point that was reached at the beginning of the Intifada in 2000. And they've reached the right kind of conclusion, which is that Israel has to look to its past, to what happened in 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has referred to it in his recent book, and that an acknowledgement of that ethnic cleansing must begin until Israeli Jews start to look at their history and to see what was done in 1948 and why it was done, confront those ghosts. Really no progress can be made in any kind of peace process. And I'm not just talking inside Israel in terms of civil rights movement and recognition of the legitimate rights that Palestinians inside Israel have, but also the legitimate national rights that Palestinians have in the occupied territories. And that these questions are really connected, that this problem didn't begin in 1967, it began in 1948 with the displacement of 80% of the Palestinian population. And that wound will not heal unless it's recognized and acknowledged and come to terms with. So there are some groups. One of the most significant of them is an organization called Zochrot, which means remembering in Hebrew. And they go around there are nearly 500 Palestinian villages that were destroyed after 1948 by the army. And they go to many of these communities and post signs telling you about these places, just road signs, just to tell you the names of the main street, for instance. Now, a lot of these communities are on land that's now owned by Jewish communities like the kibbutz. And they're very brave, these activists. I mean, they often find that they're greeted with a great deal of hostility. The local members of the kibbutz will come out, will try and evict them. They will call the police. The police regularly turn out. Only 2 weeks ago, they had a demonstration in what is now called a mixed city, called Ramleh, which was originally a Palestinian city before 1948. There are ghetto neighborhoods, Palestinian ghetto neighborhoods attached to Ramleh, which is really a Jewish city with these ghetto neighborhoods. And they went to these areas to post signs telling you what these streets were called before 1948. They now all have Zionist names, but before that they had their original Arabic names, and the police turned up and evicted everybody, and they arrested several members of Zochrot. So I mean, there's a great deal of hostility at all levels, but from the police force, from ordinary Israeli Jews, against these kinds of activities. But I think they're important, and they are starting to change, even if it's among a small community inside Israel. They are starting to change the understanding of what went on. I've noticed, I've been going to some of these meetings that Zochrot has had in these destroyed villages for the last couple of years, and I've noticed that the size of the number of people turning out for them is growing all the time, and also a much broader community of people. It's ordinary Israelis turning out, not just a small group of radical activists and left-wingers. So that's a hopeful sign, but unfortunately it's still a very small community of people. So a lot of work needs to be done. It's difficult to know who can do that work in a way that isn't going to lead to confrontation, because there is so much resistance to the idea of acknowledging what happened here in 1948, confronting it and dealing with it.
What about challenges in the Israeli courts, the disputes over land rights, civil rights, family unification? Aren't some of these battles being waged in the courts?
Well, the Israeli courts have helped in a marginal way. I mean, they do stop the worst excesses of discrimination. But I think it would be wrong to see the courts as a solution. The courts I think the main issue for the Israeli courts are to keep Israel's image as a Jewish and democratic state. I mean, this is why I called the book The Unmasking of the Jewish and Democratic State, because what I was doing in the book was showing you really where Zionism was heading. Where its attitude towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel was heading. And Avigdor Lieberman typifies that. He's seen as a very eccentric, maverick kind of figure inside Israel, but he's not really. I mean, he's very much part of the Israeli mainstream, maybe the right, but still very much part of the Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert kind of range of political values, right from what now is called the centre to the right wing. It's worth remembering that Lieberman was once the Director General of the Likud party. He was also the head of Benjamin Netanyahu's office when he was Prime Minister. So Lieberman is not some freakish character who's come out of nowhere. I mean, he's come very much out of the same tradition as people like Olmert and Netanyahu, who really are where Israel is heading. I mean, the Labour Party has become a much weaker force politically. But I actually think it's important to remember, and this is maybe goes back to the question of the courts. I mean, the courts see themselves very much in the tradition of Labour Zionism. They see themselves, I mean, somebody like the former Chief Justice, Aaron Barak, you might compare him to a figure like Shimon Peres. He's seen as kind of essentially as a left-wing figure inside Israel. But I think you've got to remember people like Peres, Rabin before him, were part of this whole movement that was designed to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. They were part of the process that engineered that ethnic cleansing. Rabin was there and actually was part of the ethnic cleansing of a major Palestinian city, Lid, in 1948. Peres was a later figure, but I mean, he was involved in another episode that people tend to forget about, which was in 1976 here inside Israel, when there were demonstrations against the land thefts that were being organized by the state in the 1970s and before. And in 1976, the Palestinians inside Israel had their first demonstration, peaceful protest in their communities against these waves of land confiscations. And Rabin and Peres, who were in charge of the country then, sent the army in, and 6 Palestinians were killed in a community not far from Nazareth here called Sachnin. So there's been a history of Labour Zionists committing the same kinds of crimes against the Palestinians that we see the right wing now demanding. But they're not really breaking with the traditions of Zionism inside Israel. I think that there's been a continuity in terms of this, and I think you see this very much with the courts. The courts are very interested in preserving Israel's image as a democracy, and therefore the grosser abuses of civil rights here against the Palestinians are curbed, as they are in the occupied territories. But the fundamental issues are never dealt with, and they're not dealt with because they are the backbone of Israel being a Jewish state. For instance, the nationalization of 93% of the land inside Israel, which can be leased only to Jews and which Palestinians have no right or access to. This is a fundamental tenet of Zionism as it has been applied by Israel. the idea that the land here is being held in trust, not for Israeli citizens, but for Jews around the world. Now, the courts can't dare touch that issue, can't confront it, can't overturn it, because to do so would be to negate the whole concept of Israel as a Jewish state. So the courts will never deal with that kind of issue, and they will never make reparations to the Palestinians on that level. And I think you see the same kinds of things happening in the occupied territories. There's certain issues which cannot be dealt with and which are always termed security issues. So you will see, for instance, that the court will make minor adjustments to the path of the wall going across the West Bank, where it's indefensible. The annexation of land to Israel, farming land and communities cut off from their land. Where things get too bad, where it looks too bad for Israel, the courts will meddle. But on the essential issue of the wall being built inside Palestinian areas, the courts won't touch it, because to touch it to look at it, to examine it, to confront it, would be to start to question the whole basis of what Israel is doing and where Zionism is heading. And the court is not courageous enough to do that. So I don't think we should look to the court to help at that kind of level.
Could you describe some concrete examples, perhaps drawn from your book, or perhaps from some of your recent articles, to describe what life is like for non-Jewish citizens of Israel? What sorts of discrimination does one confront in Israel today?
Well, I think it works at all levels. And right from when you start your education, let's maybe take some of the main themes. Education. If you grow up here, you have a state education system, two separate state education systems, one for Jews, one for Arabs. The Arab education system is run by Jewish officials. There's no control over the education that the Arabs have here. So, for instance, the teachers here, if you want to be a teacher in an Arab school here, you have to submit to security checks from the Shin Bet, the domestic security service. If they don't like you, they don't like your family, they don't like what you want to teach, they don't agree with your political perspectives, if you have ever been involved in any political activity, you can't be a teacher here. So let's just look at the schools. If you're a child going to an Arab school here, you go to an institution which is run and controlled and policed. I mean, even the thoughts that you have in that school are being policed by Jewish officials who make sure that you can't do projects that have anything to do with your Palestinian identity, that you don't know anything about your history, you don't know that you're actually connected with the Palestinian people who live only a short distance. Jenin is only a 20-minute drive from Nazareth. But you can't look at those kinds of issues in an Arab school inside Israel. Your teachers can't discuss these issues. If you want to ask what the PLO is, I know, for instance, children sometimes here want to know what the PLO is. They don't know what the PLO is. If they ask their teacher, the teacher has to say, I can't talk about this. If the teacher replies, and I have friends who are teachers here, I've heard stories, for instance, where one teacher did answer a question like this and explain in purely neutral terms what the PLO was, described it historically as an organization, what it was and who were members and what it had achieved. 2 days later, that teacher was called in to the local police station. They knew everything that had happened in that classroom, and the teacher was fired. Now, that raises all sorts of questions about not only the freedom that this teacher has, but how did the Shin Bet know what was said in that classroom? Because, and this is quite a frightening thought, because even children are being recruited to spy inside the schools. There are well-known families in every community, Arab community inside Israel, which are recruited by the police forces, and it works right through the family. So even the children will be encouraged by their parents to inform on the school, on the teachers, what's being said in the school. So really there's no sense of having the space to think about who you are, no sense of your identity or your history. And that's deeply damaging to anybody who lives here, not really to know who you are or what you are, particularly when your state doesn't want to define you as an Israeli or as a citizen, as a proper citizen. So you're really left with nothing. There's a kind of vacuum at the heart of your identity, which I think is profoundly damaging and is difficult for people who've never experienced that really to understand what it means. Let's look at another issue, employment, for instance. Now, Israel was founded on important concepts inside labor Zionism, for instance, was the idea of what they called Hebrew labor, which was most colonial movements when they come to another country, what they usually do is they try and use the labor of the natives. It's cheap, and they exploit the local people. Now, what was interesting about Israel when it first arrived, when Jews started arriving in the first waves of immigration to Palestine, was that they were actually discouraged from using the natives. With this whole idea of Hebrew labor, that Jews were redeeming the land and so on. And that has continued. It hasn't ended just because Israel became a state. There's still this very strong notion of Hebrew labor, and it reaches all sorts of aspects of the economy. There's the most obvious way it's used, which is that by the government, which says that all sorts of areas of the economy are security related, and so Palestinian citizens aren't allowed to work in them. And that can include anything really you can think of, including, for instance, textile factories. Israel used to have a very large textile industry, which has ended. But a lot of the textile industry here was based around the making clothes and uniforms for the army. So Palestinians weren't allowed to be employed in these factories because this was considered to be security-related work. There's a huge armaments industry here, which of course Palestinians are not allowed to be involved in. There's the airports, which Palestinian citizens can't be involved in. There's the whole security industry itself. It's very difficult for Palestinians to get employment in the police force here. Even inside their own communities, there are very limited numbers of Palestinians are allowed to become members of any of the security forces. The Shin Bet, for instance, they're almost entirely excluded from. So there are large areas of the economy in which the government says people can't be employed in. There are also many jobs where you need to have worked in the army before you find employment. That excludes most Palestinians as well. There's if you like, the popular racism of Israeli Jewish employers who would rather employ a Jew than a Palestinian. So there's that level of discrimination. So at various levels, it becomes, if you're a Palestinian here, it's very difficult to find work. Most of the Palestinian community here before 1948 were engaged in labor, in agricultural labor. They were working as farmers on their land. Now, most of that land, as we'll get to next, was confiscated, so they don't have their farmland anymore. So what kind of employment is left open to them? Very little. Most of it's service industries, and also working inside the Jewish economy, but as very low-paid casual laborers. In the kibbutz farms, they sometimes work as day laborers there. There's quarries, for instance, they sometimes work in the quarries. There are some factories where they work as well, meat processing factories and so on. But they're very, also of course the building sites. They build most of the country as well, Palestinian citizens, and also Palestinians from the occupied territories. You've got to remember that they very similar employment patterns there. You know, who was building the wall? Who is building the wall? Unfortunately, it's mostly Palestinians because there's not many other ways that they can work. So Israel has really had a stranglehold on what kind of employment is available to Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, and it's restricted that very much to casual, low-paid labour. And there are very high unemployment rates in Palestinian communities. Typically, the official figures are double what they are in the Jewish community. Actually, it's much, much higher than that because the figures themselves conceal the discrimination. There are many reasons why Palestinians inside Israel cannot claim unemployment benefit and are not included in the unemployment figures. Some of the organisations in Nazareth who work with the unemployed suggest that the figures may be 4 times higher in the Palestinian community than in the Jewish community. So whereas there's about 9-10% unemployment in the Jewish community, it could be up to 40% unemployment in the Palestinian community, so it's very, very high. That's employment. Let's now look at land. Land, which is a very important issue here because it's been the bedrock of the Palestinian identity. I mean, it was a farming, rural peasant community until 1948, largely. And land was key to the community's sense of their own identity and who they were. Now, what Israel has done is nationalise most of the land inside Israel. As I said, 93% of it is nationalised and off limits, effectively, to Palestinians. It means that they can't have any control over their own planning or their own communities. Most of the communities here, and you see it in Nazareth, they're extremely tightly built Palestinian communities. There's really massive overcrowding in them. There's also massive illegal building, which Israel likes to talk a lot about. Well, there's a good reason why there's a lot of illegal building, which is it's almost impossible to get a building permit if you're a Palestinian. And that's again true in the occupied territories and inside Israel. The parallels are always there. So if you're a Palestinian inside Israel, not only do you have no control over your own communities, the municipality has often has no control over its own communities, because the decisions are taken by planning committees, which again exclude Palestinian citizens. They're not entitled to make their own planning decisions. So Jews decide whether you can build buildings inside Palestinian communities, including inside Nazareth. So if you want to get a building permit, you have to go to a Jewish planning committee, which makes a decision for you. Usually it turns you down, which is why there's so much illegal building inside Palestinian communities, because they can't get permission to build. And that means that not only do the elected representatives of the community not have control over their communities, it means that most people here end up finding themselves being increasingly criminalized, which is another concept which is probably difficult for people to understand. But the idea that you have no choice. Imagine living with your parents, getting married, and expecting, as most of us would do, to be able to go and live in our own home. Here it's a big problem. You can't. There's no Palestinian communities have been built inside Israel since 1948. It's the same number of communities, 123, that existed in 1948. So where you can live is only in the communities that existed in 1948, pretty much on the same land that was developed since then. So, for instance, you can't, as a young professional couple here, go and buy yourself an apartment in another community. Perhaps a new community has been built where you might be able to create the kind of networks of organization, sense of your own community, establish new ideas about how to live in a new community. These kind of possibilities are totally denied to you. You have to live in the communities where your parents live. Now, what happens for most people is that they end up building on top of their parents' home. Those homes are usually illegal, and in building an illegal home on top of your parents' home, you make your parents' home illegal as well. This works at all sorts of levels in terms of creating stresses within the community. There's no real professional class, and there never has been a professional class inside Israel among the Palestinians, because people cannot develop their careers in terms of employment. They can't get kinds of jobs that would lead to a professional class here. For instance, engineering is not allowed. I know several people who are trained as engineers, but they can't get jobs as engineers because nobody will employ them to be an engineer, because most of the engineering projects here are seen as security related. Again, they're often to do with the occupation, building settlements in the occupied territories, or the infrastructure that leads to these settlements. So you can't get a job, for instance, as an engineer. So not only is there not really a professional class here because of employment restrictions, but also because of the very tight nature of people's geographic location. You end up living next to your parents, and that might not sound so bad, but in terms of the way that the society itself can develop, it's extremely restrictive. It means that people don't have the freedom to break with the traditions of their community. What they end up doing is because of social pressures to lead lives very similar to their parents' lives, it becomes a kind of restriction, a break on where you can head, how different you can be. These are like very, if you like, rural communities. Even though Nazareth is a fairly large city, it's 70,000 people, and it lives there. There is a number of communities Palestinian communities bordering Nazareth, which make up a kind of conurbation of about 190,000 people. The communities dotted around Nazareth. People still living the way they were living 30, 40, 50 years ago, because there's no place where young Palestinians, young professionals can reinvent their identity, reinvent their kind of lives that they want to lead, and break away from the restrictions of the society that are already here. And Israel wants that. I mean, that's planned. I mean, that's the intention, is to ensure that the focus of people's lives is extremely restricted, it's extremely narrow, and that they can't start to reimagine a way of living or organize in ways, new ways. I think I'm probably drifting here a bit, but it's difficult to explain exactly what I mean here.
It's hard not to interpret some of these policies, certainly those Israeli policies imposed in the occupied territories, and also those imposed on Palestinian Israelis, to interpret these policies as a deliberate effort to drive Palestinians out, to force them to see their future as professionals, as academics, as lawyers or doctors, to see their future outside of Israel,
Exactly.
to leave the country, to go somewhere else, to go to Europe or go to the United States.
Well, I'll give you a good example. There's been a campaign here among the Palestinian citizens of Israel for many decades to create Israel's first Arab university, teaching in the Arabic language. It's never been allowed. Israel has always made sure that it wouldn't happen. Now, there are good reasons why it doesn't want an Arab university. It would help create this professional class, this leadership that would help Palestinians, organize Palestinians inside Israel, give them new vision, new understanding. What happens instead is that if you don't want to go to an Israeli university where you're going to have to be taught in Hebrew, which is your second language, and it immediately puts you at a disadvantage against Israeli Jewish pupils, students who you're competing with, your options are to go to Jordan, for instance, and go to one of the universities there, which a lot of Palestinian students now do. They go to Jordan and they study at one of the universities in Amman. Now, once they finish that education, there's a good chance they meet somebody there, maybe a Jordanian, and maybe they think to get married. And there's a good chance that they won't come back. And that's exactly how Israel likes it. And you'll see that in all sorts of policies that are here, which encourage people to leave. There was one of the few political parties, dissenting non-Zionist political parties that were allowed inside Israel was the Communist Party. It was mainly because in its early days, the Jewish community was the organizers and leaders of the Communist Party inside Israel. So it was difficult to ban it. But one of the benefits for Israel in terms of its Palestinian community was that the Communist Party used to give grants to Palestinians to go and study. Most Palestinian intellectuals here could not get to an Israeli university. The restrictions were too severe. So if you wanted to get an education as a doctor, as a dentist, as a lawyer, some of the main trades that are allowed here, as I said, the service industries, what would typically happen is that you would join the Communist Party here and then apply for a scholarship. And often people got scholarships. A number of people I know here who speak East European language. I mean, all sorts of languages: Moldovan, Hungarian, Russian, and that's because they studied and trained in the communist bloc, in the Soviet bloc. Now, many of them didn't come back. They married a Moldovan or Hungarian, and they stayed there. And again, Israel was quite happy with that arrangement and encouraged it. And it was one of the reasons it made it so difficult for there are many reasons, but one of the reasons it made it so difficult for Palestinian citizens to get to Israeli universities, as is still the case. It's still extremely difficult for them to get to universities and still underrepresented there.
What are some of the other elements of the conflict that you address in your book?
I think the other really important issue, which we haven't mentioned so far, is and it's a key question for Israel, again, both sides of the Green Line, is the question of demography, the question of numbers. Who has the larger number of people? And that's been a Zionist obsession, as we know, since before 1948. It was one of the driving forces for the whole program of ethnic cleansing that was carried out in 1948. Because Israel, to be a Jewish state, needs a very strong Jewish majority. Otherwise, it doesn't have the legitimacy. If it's kind of 50% Palestinians, 50% Jews, difficult to sell that idea of a Jewish state as a legitimate idea. So Israel has been working assiduously for many decades to ensure that demographically it's in control, that it has the higher numbers. Now, one of the questions that I look at in the book is this whole problem of the numbers game for Israel. One of the things that Ehud Olmert mentioned in November 2003 in an interview in Haaretz, shortly before Ariel Sharon announced the disengagement, in an interview he said, the biggest threat to us, I'm paraphrasing here, but the biggest threat to us would be if the Palestinians start a campaign, a struggle for one man, one vote, just as the blacks did in South Africa under apartheid, because this would look like a legitimate struggle. And that would be dangerous to us as a Jewish state. And it's not insignificant that a month later, Ariel Sharon mentioned for the first time at the Herzliya conference his idea for disengagement from Gaza, because the two ideas are intimately linked. The disengagement from Gaza, and this is one of the major arguments I make in the book, was entirely a demographic move. It was a way of buying time for the state, just as demographers inside Israel were warning that the numbers of Palestinians and Jews were reaching parity, that within 10 years, there would be a similar number of Jews and Palestinians inside the greater Israel area. It was at that point that Sharon was sold on the idea of the disengagement. Gaza had never been particularly important to the Zionist dream. It had a large number of Palestinians, 1.4 million of them. By getting rid of them, severing them off from the greater Israel dream, he immediately bought Israel a couple of decades to sort out its other demographic problems, which was Palestinians inside Israel and also the Palestinians in the West Bank. So, and I think it's important to realize that the demographic threat is seen to be as much inside Israel, if not more inside Israel, than it is in the occupied territories. This is often overlooked. And Israel has been working very carefully over the last few years to manage the demographic problem inside Israel. And that's where we're seeing the new ideas, like the Lieberman ideas, about transferring the population from inside Israel into the occupied territories. And one of the major arguments I'm making in the book is that the disengagement and the idea of convergence, which has now been put on hold, but effectively it's happening anyway because the West Bank wall is still being built. I mean, that's the new political line Israel is creating. Well, what's the significance of that political line? And I think the significance of it is that Israel will create some kind of series of ghettos which it will then want the international community to call a Palestinian state. And it will then say, well, that is the place where the Palestinians have their right to recognition and to exercise their sovereign rights. That is a Palestinian state. If you want to be a Palestinian, go to that Palestinian state. And that's basically Lieberman's argument. His argument is, if you want to be a Palestinian and you're a citizen of Israel, well, then you have to renounce your citizenship and go and live in that Palestinian state. That's the whole concept of this transfer of the Little Triangle, this area that's very close to the West Bank, which he wants to be moved in on the other side of the wall, so it will become effectively part of this Palestinian state, this pseudo-Palestinian state that they're talking about. They're also talking about the idea that if you want to demand a state of all its citizens, which is seen as treasonous and subversive, that will become an illegitimate political platform inside Israel. It already, in fact, is an illegitimate platform. It's not possible as a political party to stand here and demand or to not acknowledge Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It hasn't been enforced yet, but that is the law. So at some point we can assume that Israel will start enforcing that. But what people are talking about is loyalty oaths. And I think that's what's likely to for the rest of the Palestinian community inside Israel to face quite soon, will be these loyalty oaths. You will have to pledge allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which will negate any claims you might have to Israel being a state of all its citizens. That's the way you negate that threat. You say, well, if you want to live inside Israel and be a Palestinian, you have to acknowledge that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and you can't challenge that. And if you want to, then you have to go and live in this pseudo-Palestinian state we're creating next door. I think that's the game plan. How soon it will be realized, how effectively, is difficult to say, but that's the vision that emerged. I think that's the Sharon vision, it's the Olmert vision, and I think it's also the Army's vision, and that's what we're seeing being created at the moment, a series of ghettos which will be called a Palestinian state. They'll be behind a series of walls and fences, and if you want to be a Palestinian inside Israel, then you're going to have to say, okay, well, my Palestinian identity is just a kind of symbolic identity. It doesn't have any real meaning. And I pledge allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which, in other words, I have to pledge allegiance to a state which discriminates against me, which doesn't recognize me as an equal to a Jewish citizen. And that's going to put Palestinians inside Israel in a very difficult situation. They're going to be faced with a choice of either accepting their second or third class status inside Israel permanently, or leaving the state, going and living in a state which is, as we've seen in Gaza, even after the withdrawal of the settlers and of the army, it's no kind of life, it's no kind of statehood. It's a prison, a very large prison. And I don't think many Palestinian citizens of Israel are going to opt for that choice. So they're effectively going to have to buy into their second or third class citizenship. And I think that's a clever move by Israel, and it might well be bought by the international community.
I'd like to ask about countertrends.
Yeah.
The description of these Bantustans, the strategy being imposed on the West Bank, it's not something new. We have the recent history of South Africa as a precedent, as a guide to where this may lead. What do you see as the counter-trends, the reservoirs of hope, that another direction might be possible for the people of the region?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not great on hope. I will do my best, though. I think one has to recognize that all regimes learn from their predecessors' mistakes, and I have no doubt there were very close ties between Israel and apartheid South Africa, and I have no doubt that Israel has learnt the lessons from apartheid South Africa's failure, and it will not repeat them exactly. It will change the format and the implementation enough. It hopes that that the international community will buy it. And that's really what matters, or Americans will buy it, the American regime will buy it, which is what really counts. So I think there's that first obstacle, I mean, that anybody who opposes what's going on faces, is that Israel isn't going to be stupid and just replicate apartheid South Africa. It's going to do it more cleverly. And so we're going to have to be more clever in our arguments. The second thing is that we have an obstacle which the opponents of apartheid South Africa didn't have, which is that if we criticize Israel, we're called anti-Semites. That's a very powerful argument. It's a very powerful argument for most people. And it's a big problem. You know, if you opposed apartheid South Africa, what did people call you? You know, they didn't have a word for it. I mean, if you supported the rights of the black people of South Africa, in general, that was seen as a good thing. It helped also that America has a large black population, and so you had support on your side if you were fighting for the rights of the black population of South Africa. Now the problem in America is almost reversed, where you have a large, or not maybe such a large community, but you have a significant, influential Jewish community who in the main are quite supportive of Israel. Not on everything, but still fairly supportive. And so the power balance is rather different, I think, in this case, and it's much harder to argue your case. There aren't so many Palestinians inside America, and those that there are tend to keep their heads down rather than out there arguing vociferously for the rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. So I think we should be aware of those hurdles, those obstacles, and not suggest that it's going to be, the fight is as easy as it was in the case of apartheid South Africa. What hope is there? I think there's always the hope that that anyone arguing for and campaigning for universal rights and for justice, you know, you have right on your side. It's a powerful argument, and as long as it's heard, I think you can make a significant dent in, a significant impression on people. I mean, I think there is also maybe a third element to this, third obstacle which I haven't mentioned also, which is the American media, which is not very supportive or very realistic about what's going on here, and is part of the problem as well, because it prevents ordinary Americans from really hearing what's going on. So that's another obstacle that has to be confronted. But as long as we can make ourselves heard, we can make people realize what the issues are and what's going on, there is the hope that message will be understood and will be powerful, because we're talking about universal rights here. We're talking about Palestinians having the same rights as Israeli Jews. So that's one small ray of hope. I think the other hope is that Israeli Jews are starting to realize that Palestinians, I mean, there's been a process for the Israeli Jewish population here. They've undergone a series of stages of recognition of the Palestinians, which may be difficult for us to have imagined that they would have been able to, for instance, recognize the idea of a Palestinian state 20 or 30 years ago. People didn't talk in those terms. I mean, I have Israeli Jewish friends who older ones, who remember a time when it was just not possible to talk about Palestinians ever having a state. Well, it is possible to talk about that now. I don't think it's very realistic. Most Israeli Jews' understanding of what might be needed to create a Palestinian state isn't very realistic yet, but at least they've made that kind of mental leap. And that's a first stage. I think the communities, the small groups I was talking about earlier, like Zochrot, and there are other ones, Tayush is another one, important one. These small groups are very active, they're very vociferous, and they're very committed, and they are slowly starting to make an impression. There was a lot of hostility, for instance, as I mentioned, to Zochrot when they first started their activities. But in general, I've noticed, and I know from Etin Bronstein, who's the director of Zochrot, that there's a larger number of Jews who are at least curious about what they're doing. Maybe not approving of it, but curious. Not immediately hostile. When he first started doing these signposting projects in the destroyed villages, he was just met with hostility and sometimes with physical violence. Now, more often there's a curiosity, there's a sense of who are you, what are you doing, why are you doing it? And that's a change, and it's an important change, and it's the beginning of a process of understanding. It leads somewhere hopeful, and that's, to me, the small sign of hope that I cling to, that if Israeli Jews can start to want to know why somebody might want to put a signpost up with an Arabic name on it, that's a beginning. And it's a small one, but it's a beginning, and it could lead to something significant. So that's maybe the hope I can offer, but I appreciate it's not a huge one.
You've spoken a little about the United States, the main benefactor of the State of Israel. Could you talk about the United States' role in influencing the direction of events here?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's a particularly difficult question maybe for me to answer. I'm not American, I'm British, and I live in Israel and have been for the last 5 years. So I tend to see things from this end rather than, I read a lot about what's going on in America, but again, it's not my personal knowledge that I'm drawing on here. It's my impressions from reading the media. I think that we're in a state of flux right now. I think Americans are in a state of flux about the whole Middle East. I mean, there are big questions being opened up. Really, Israel had a little comfortable monopoly on what was going on here in terms of our understanding. Israeli soldiers were the ones that died in wars against the Arabs, and so it was difficult to question what Israel was doing, and they were the ones suffering, so who are we to tell them what to be doing? But that's not true anymore. I mean, there are lots of Americans, as we know, dying and being injured in Iraq, not so far away. And the question is, why are they there, and what are they achieving? And is there a connection between that and Israel? Israel was one of the big cheerleaders of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, I was here at the time, and I remember how there was almost uniform support for the idea of invading Iraq. And we know that neoconservatives who have a strong affinity with Israel were also key movers behind the whole idea of invading Iraq. So I think that these kind of questions are starting to be raised for the first time in America. People are asking, what's Israel's role in the Middle East? What's it trying to achieve? And how does that relate to us in America and our involvement in the Middle East now? And as we've seen with this recent paper by Walton Mearsheimer, some significant people in American intellectual world, and I think we're starting to see beginnings of people raising issues about what is American foreign policy in the Middle East doing? What's it trying to achieve, and who's pushing for what? So I think there are questions being raised. I mean, it's clear to me, even from here, I can see that Americans there is a movement there. People start to question what's going on and whether Israel is playing fair in the Middle East. Whether there is a connection, as we've also seen with this recent Hamilton-Baker report as well. Question of how connected are the questions of what's happening to the Palestinians and wider issues and problems America's facing in the Middle East. Hostility. So I think that Israel hasn't got a monopoly on wisdom anymore. It isn't controlling the debate, and that's going to become harder and harder for it to do. The debate is going to start widening out, and other people are going to start having their voice heard. And that's only I think that's only a healthy thing. How quickly it'll happen, I don't know, though.
Let's talk about the sort of issues that typically have a tremendous influence on how many people view the conflict here in Palestine, Israel. I wonder if we could talk about the Qassam rockets that are currently being fired from Gaza into Israeli communities near the border. Certainly when these issues are reported in the United States, they are typically placed within the context of Israel's struggle to provide security for its people.
Yeah, sure.
Just within the last week, and we're speaking on December 28th, 2 Israeli teenagers were very seriously injured by a Qassam rocket that struck the town of Sderot. How do you talk about these incidents and the violent resistance that is a part of the resistance against the Israeli occupation?
Sure. Well, I think there are 2 ways of looking at that issue. I mean, one, and I think it's an important one to remember, and one that tends to be ignored in the States, I think, is that actually the Palestinians do have a right under international law to resist the occupation, and they can resist it violently. We can then have a debate about what's sensible resistance or what's productive resistance and what's harming their cause. But that's largely a matter of perception often, and that's something that the Palestinians don't have a lot of control over. That's how their resistance is framed by, for instance, the international media and the American media. So I want to make the first point that, of course, the Palestinians do have a right to resist the occupation, and it's important to remember that, not to forget it. But I think there is a valid question about how productive, how useful, how successful the armed resistance has been. That's a question that I think Palestinians have been having through the Intifada. They've been seriously considering how successful has an armed Intifada been, and I think we tend to assume that the lull in suicide attacks is a reflection of the building of the wall. I actually think that's a major mistake. I think it's actually a conscious decision by the Palestinians. What people possibly abroad don't realize is that the wall is far from finished, and there are major gaps in it, including in Jerusalem still. So that any suicide bomber who wants to get into Israel still pretty much can. I mean, if you're determined to get into Israel, and we can assume suicide bombers are pretty determined, they can get in. So the question is, why has there been such a drop in the number of attacks? And I think that's a conscious choice by many of the Palestinian factions to stop the suicide bombings. I think they realized they weren't being helpful to the Palestinian cause. And we tend to just assume it's because entry to Israel has been blocked. I think that's far too simplistic a view of what's been going on. So there is a debate within Palestinian society about what to do. But I think maybe the most important point, which is usually neglected, is that most of the time Palestinians are resisting in non-violent ways to the occupation, and it's almost entirely ignored. When they resist non-violently, nobody notices, which is one of the reasons I think that the Intifada turned so violent, was because Palestinians realized that unless they were violent, nobody really noticed. Nobody took note. The media didn't turn up. One of the most high-profile, but still not very high-profile, acts of resistance that has been happening every Friday for more than a year now has been in a small village called Bilin, where Israel is building a wall on Palestinian land, annexing farmland from that village and destroying any hope of the livelihoods of the people who live there. Now there's been demonstrations, non-violent demonstrations there every Friday for more than a year, attended by local Palestinians, by international solidarity activists, and by Israelis, both Palestinian citizens and Israeli Jews. That's had virtually no coverage. There's very little coverage of that, and it's significant because those non-violent demonstrations have been greeted by the Israeli army with violence. What's happened to those demonstrators is that they've regularly faced rubber bullets, some live ammunition. People have been shot, injured. They've been using experimental crowd control techniques, which has been covered by the Israeli media. I mean, the Israeli media have written quite extensively about this, but you very rarely see anything written in the international media or American media about this. So that's a high-profile example of nonviolent resistance. But of course, there are small examples of that going on all the time. Just the struggle that Palestinians make every day to go to their schools or their universities or hospitals, these are forms of nonviolent resistance, the occupation, because the occupation is all about stopping them doing these things. These 500 plus checkpoints that exist all over the West Bank are designed to stop Palestinians leading normal lives, to going to school or university or to hospital, or getting to the market to buy things or to sell produce. So just turning up at the checkpoint and refusing to be intimidated by it is a form of nonviolent resistance. But of course it gets no coverage whatsoever. So I think in a way the whole question of resistance has become a trap for the Palestinians. If they resist in nonviolent ways, nobody notices, nobody cares, and Israel wins. And if they resist violently, then everybody condemns them and calls them savages and barbarians. So really they can't win on that argument. I think the whole question, which is why it brings us back to the question of what are their rights under international law? Well, their rights under international law are that they have the right to resist the occupation in any way they choose, which is violently or non-violently. Obviously they should be resisting insofar as they can, in ways that target military facilities, soldiers and so on. But it's interesting, when they do that as well, they get condemned. When they captured a soldier who was at a military post just on the borders of Gaza, firing part of an artillery battery that was firing into Gaza, and therefore an entirely legitimate military target. When they captured that soldier, Gilad Shalit has become this kind of poster boy for those who kind of want to argue that the Palestinians are not behaving in legitimate ways. It's being used by the politicians to justify the sanctions that have been imposed on the Palestinians. I mean, it's become a kind of contributing factor to an argument that was already being made against Hamas and its election. So I think in these kind of ways that the Palestinians can't win, and I think that's the way the whole thing is set up, so they can't win. Israel and America have kind of engineered the debate, the argument, in such a way that whatever the Palestinians do, they're playing foul. And I think it's important that we highlight that all the time as well. There is no way that the Palestinians can behave which is going to encourage Israel to start saying, yes, these are people we can negotiate with, or to say, oh yeah, okay, Hamas can do the right thing. I think that's one of the reasons why the Palestinians have ended up with a Hamas government, because they've tried the route of collaboration. Fatah was renowned for helping Israel. I mean, even some of its senior figures were involved in selling cement to the Israelis to build a wall. I mean, there's some rather unpleasant and unsavory episodes involving Fatah, which ordinary Palestinians were very aware of. It didn't matter that Fatah was playing Israel's game. Israel still didn't move towards creating any kind of Palestinian state. So I think Palestinians realized that there was no point even in staying with their political leaders who were prepared to collaborate or prepared to go easy on Israel. They decided to play tough, and Hamas was the natural choice for them. Now we're condemning them because they've made that choice, but we're the ones who forced them into making that choice, because we didn't do anything, we didn't encourage them, we didn't give them any prizes or awards for doing what we wanted them to do, or said we wanted them to do. And I'm using we here rather. But you know, I think that the international community has to take responsibility for the election of Hamas. Hamas is a sign that the Palestinians are fed up with being lied to, fed up with being mistreated, and that they're no longer prepared to play ball in that kind of way.
You've been listening to an interview with Jonathan Cook. Jonathan Cook is a British journalist and author based in Nazareth, Israel. His book, Blood and Religion, The Unmasking of the Jewish and Democratic State, is just out from Pluto Press. The interview took place in Nazareth on December 28, 2006. You can read more of Jonathan Cook's reporting from the Middle East by visiting his website at www.justice.org. jkcook.net. You can find out more about this program by visiting our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to related websites, as well as other interviews and lecture programs featuring Ali Abunimah, Phyllis Bennis, Ilan Pape, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.